What's going on, guys, and welcome back. Say hello to Frederick J. Dukes, or better known as the Blob, Snap's biggest card ever to come to the game. Quite literally, he has a capability of 20, 40, 60, no, how about 100 freaking power? This guy's an absolute unit within Snap. Now, the Blob is a 6-cost, 4-power card with the on-reveal ability of merging your entire deck into the Blob. He'll gain its total power. Again, he's not destroying these cards. He's merging it, something like a Hulkbuster or Phoenix Force interaction. Now, he's got the ongoing effect of his most notable trait within Marvel, that he cannot be moved. Now, there's a lot to break down with the Blob, but before we get to the pros, the cons, the best decks and combos that I can come up with while early playtesting them, I want to go ahead and give my first impressions on the Blob, the new Series 5 card, and if you should get him. Now, the Spotlight caches are great with his week. You've got things like Ravonna Renslayer. Very good cards. If you don't have them, definitely more enticing to get him as a new card. But as far as what I think about him, let's break it down with star ratings. Now, kicking off with his performance, I'm actually going to bump up what I initially was going to give him. I'm going to give him a 4-star rating as far as what he can do in a Marvel Snap deck. More on that later. We have a fun factor, which Blob is easily the top of the charts there. I'm going to give him a 5-star rating of just pure fun. And then flexibility is going to be about a 4-star, a lot better than I once thought. Now, let's go ahead and talk about some pros and cons with the Blob. Now, starting with the pros, his biggest one at that, you guys know it by now. Darkhawk decks are always on top of the meta, and the Blob is able to easily shut this down, take him to 0 power. Huge swing in terms of playing something on turn 6. People love playing Darkhawk on turn 6, so it's a huge surprise, and I can't wait to see this on the competitive ladder. Now, on top of that, he also is a huge location swing card. Decks like Shuri that depend on the double Red Skull, you can play Blob, and he's one of the few cards that can easily swap that lane, giving you the win. Or maybe a Hulk Infinite deck, a Destroy deck with these big knolls, these death lanes. Blob is awesome at swapping your opponent's biggest lane to give you the win. He's also obviously probably one of the biggest power cards by himself. He is the biggest power card by himself. Obviously, Black Panther Wong can get crazy, but that's you're gonna see Blob can get to just crazy numbers. He doesn't require that much synergy. Yeah, you need big cards, but it doesn't matter if you don't, because you're gonna see he's got great average numbers for a 6-cost card. And then lastly, guys, low synergy. The guy just doesn't need really anything. Yeah, you could put Infinite Magneto into the decks. It's a lot of fun. But we're going to go and talk about averages here, because as a 6-cost card, the Blob is typically just good stats no matter what deck you're playing for the most part, outside the crazy folks playing like Cerebro Zero. Now, of course, with this, he has some cons, but a lot of them can be mitigated, which is great. Obviously, guys, he is draw dependent. If you're building a deck around the Blob, you need to get the Blob. But I found him best when you kind of just have good competitive decks and you slot Blob in as an alt win condition. He's a 6-cost card. Obviously, another con, you need the most energy to play him, or you need Limbo, which you typically don't want with the Blob because it's going to lower your deck size. And, you know, he can ruin your deck, but not really. You know, if you're playing Lockjaw, which is a fun build to have with Hela, Thanos, we're going to go into the decks in a second. Blob coming out early, if you don't have great cards in your hand, can be rough. But because of the way the decks play out, you're going to have something like Infinite. So even if Blob does, you know, land on a location, you just play Infinite on the other, and you should be good to go a lot of the time. Now, breaking down some specific card synergy, obviously Infinite, She-Hulk, Giganto, Thanos, Magneto. These are the best just powerhouses, if you will. These are the power cards that you'd want to play. But even things like Abomination and Arrow and lower power cards, Vision, Jane Thor, these are great as well. Now, as far as other cards that synergize well with the Blob, things like Hela, Black Knight, ramp cards with Electro and Wave. Lockjaw is able to put more cards into the deck, one of the current only ways to do so. Moon Girl can fill out your hand and give you a bigger deck through that route. On paper, Okoye isn't that bad. And then, you know, of course, Sandman, limiting your opponent and just playing a giant freaking Blob down can win a lot of games. And then lastly, we've got Taskmaster and Arnim Zola. Now, guys, do not care about this 0 power. It doesn't matter if he stays in your deck and Blob absorbs him, because you have other huge cards that work with this build either way. Taskmaster and Arnim Zola are absolutely wild with the Blob. And yes, it works. You can easily Arnim Zola the Blob for 2 giant lanes. Before we get to the decks, a lot of them I'm going to showcase are ways to get huge blobs, but I want to really state and nail in the fact just having Blob into a lot of decks you already play is going to equal good stat lines, as I've been saying. Let's, for those that aren't mathematicians, I know I'm not myself, numbers are hard. Let's go and take a look at some average kind of playouts of the Blob, even with bad, 3 cards left. Most games, you're going to have 3 cards left in your deck. Let's say you have 2 that are 3 power cards. You have 1 that's a 2 power card. That's still a 12 power Blob. That's bad numbers. And Blob is still Magneto size, right? Let's take in a 2 power, maybe a 5 power Wave is left in there. And then like an Iron Lad at 6. It's a 17 power Blob, right? So you still have a lot of ways to get Blob at huge numbers, some of the biggest that we've seen in Snap. One last one, right? Let's do like, you have 2 1 power cards in the deck. Don't know why you're running these 2, but you have them in there. And then the last card is Magneto, 18 power, right? So obviously you get it. But the averages come out to where Blob is just a good value play a good chunk of the time, and he's really going to boost up some archetypes that need the love. Now, when it comes to my favorite Blob decks, I'm going to go into these a bit more on my channel, but if you guys want to go ahead and get a taste, again, this is what I could test on a test server. Couldn't really see this in live action, but a lot of these I was looking for just the ways that the decks played out. Again, at the top of my list, I think play them in your favorite decks, but Electro Ramp is definitely a deck that loves to see the Blob. You have alternate play lines. You can flex in things like Sandman into this deck. And altogether, this deck performed extremely well in my testing of consistent Blob play. You can get Taskmaster and Arnim Zola in there as well, so that's obviously pretty crazy. And overall, it's probably my favorite of the bunch. Now, Thanos is a freaking blast. You're going to probably see a good chunk of Blob Thanos decks in the future as probably the top performers. It wasn't the best for testing because you don't always get Blob, but, you're going to see this game here that I was able to get Blob out of the Lockjaw, and you could tell that it was obviously a pretty big play where I could then win another location with some of the other cards. If you plan on playing Thanos, I think there's a lot of builds around it. This is just one build that I kind of cooked up. Yes, the Lockjaw into it is a little nutty, but I found it fun. I think it works out pretty well to cycle cards back into your deck. You have decent draw at that, and you have ways to ramp out the Blob earlier, because the earlier you ramp him, the bigger he gets. Now, lastly, we've got to talk about Hela. Hela Blob is just chaotic. It doesn't radically change Hela, but it definitely does give you much more power out there in combining cards like Lady Sif and Ghost Rider to get Blob out early, or even just having Hela pull out the Blob and like Giganto is going to win you a ton of games. Now, this deck has Black Knight. You don't need him in there at all. But if you want to replace Black Knight for even bigger cards, feel free to do so and go all in on a Lockjaw Hela build. There's way more decks that I actually play tested, but most of them resulted in just really strong Blob plays, or I just got the other cards that I needed to win the deck, like in a high Evo example. So overall, ton of fun. He's a Darkhawk counter. He's a good, powerful card. And I'm going to give him the star ratings right here that I showed earlier in the video. All right, let's go ahead and take you guys through a game here of Ramp with the Blob. So in this game that we've got here, we've got Wave, Electro in the opening hand with Magneto. Now, the thing about this deck is it's already good for on reveals. You can get Dr. Doom going off in multiple lanes. If you want to play Sandman and you choose that life, then you can also do that as well to keep your opponent in check. Now, yes, we're going against some bots here, so it's not the most accurate on a competitive basis, but it's important to see how these kind of decks play out. Now, we could do a couple of things here. As you know, in Ramp, you're kind of looking to do the biggest plays possible. We have a turn 7 in this particular game, but if it was a turn 6, we could play Wave into Blob, into Arnim Zola on turn 6. That's definitely a pretty good play. We could also just go with Electro, which I think is fine as well. Both kind of work. We don't have to give our opponent the Wave advantage. So let's go ahead and play down Electro on this left side here. And we find ourselves having Wave as well. Now, because we have the Arnim Zola play, we could play this now if we want to. Doesn't really do all that much. Heck, we can just do nothing and fill up our hand, because why not, to keep more within the deck on a turn 7 game. These bots are making elite plays here. Okay, well, they're feeling great with what they have. So obviously, usually in ramp, you could go with Black Panther or Arnim Zola. However, we're obviously going to be looking to go with the Blob. So like I said, we have some pretty big cards currently in our hand, but we have some huge ones in the deck. Blob here getting up to 42 power is absurd. Obviously, this could be lower. 42 is a little bit overkill, if you ask me. And in this game, we have Limbo, so maybe we would do some things a little bit differently. You know, we could certainly make some cases for that. But what we're going to do is just simply play Arnim Zola here on the Blob. And what's obviously beautiful about this is we're going to get a 42 and a 42. Now, we could technically play down Odin to scan the Arnim Zola again, but Blob has nothing else to absorb, so that doesn't do much for us. But very simple playline, right? You know, take this number down to 34, and we're still going to most likely beat Apocalypse decks out there and other decks that you would come across, right? So there we go, 42-42. Looks good. If the game ends here, you know, we're happy. Obviously, Blob did take the rest of our deck, so we can't play that. And at this point, 2 Odins on each lane. Not bad. You could go with a Magneto, Doctor Doom, you know, whatever way you want to look at it here. You know, we'll go ahead and go with this play, because why not? And there you go. So, you know, not a terrible example of how a ramp game could play out, even if we got Blob later. The Arnim Zola play is really looking like the one that works, because we have alternate play lines involved. There's so much more to be discovered about Blob, and I'm really looking forward to play testing him in a live environment. I'm going to Conquer, so I can't quite play him yet. But if you want to check that out, you can surely do so. Now, instead of following me and checking me out, you can go and check out a lot of other awesome content creators in Marvel Snap. We've got incredible men and women that made content for the game. I'll link a lot in the description. Can't include them all, but I definitely want to give a shout out to a lot of great creators out there. Anyway, guys, have fun with Blob, and until the next one, happy snapping.